There are sounds that define an era, that capture the essence of a place and an unrepeatable moment in history. In mid-20th century Poland, those sounds were the screech of wheels on coal-laden wagons, the muffled roar of blast furnaces that never ceased, the whistle of locomotives crossing landscapes tinged gray by perpetual soot. It was a country trying to rebuild itself between the ashes of World War II and the chains of a communist regime that had transformed every aspect of daily life. The war had left deep wounds in the Polish psyche, wounds that had not yet healed 2 decades after the last shots were fired. Nearly 6 million Polish citizens had perished, and those who survived carried the burden of memories too terrible to fully articulate. The industrial cities of the South, especially those located in the region known as Zagłębie Dąbrowskie and Upper Silesia, represented the beating heart of a nation that had bet everything on the production of coal and steel. These were the fuels that would power the socialist dream, the raw materials that would lift Poland from the rubble of war into the promised future of workers' prosperity. The communist planners in Warsaw had decreed that heavy industry would be the engine of national development, and the mining regions of the South would bear the weight of that ambition on their dust-blackened shoulders. This industrial basin stretched like a living organism of smoking chimneys, mine extraction towers, and working-class neighborhoods that had grown chaotically around the factories that gave them reason to exist. Dąbrowa Górnicza, Sosnowiec, Będzin, Czeladź, Katowice, names that resonated with the thunder of the mines, the whistle of locomotives loaded with black ore, and the perpetual smoke of foundries that never slept. These cities formed an urban conglomerate where the borders between one municipality and another were blurred, where blocks of cement buildings succeeded one another endlessly, where dusty sidewalks connected factories with markets, schools with churches, taverns with cemeteries. It was a land of workers, of men and women who rose before dawn to complete exhausting shifts in the bowels of the earth, or beside the incandescent furnaces of the steel mills. The men descended into the mines with lamps on their helmets, breathing the black dust that would destroy their lungs over the years. The women worked in textile factories, in processing plants, in industrial canteens, where they fed the armies of workers who kept the machinery of real socialism running. It was also a land where the state controlled everything, where the press served the interests of the party, and where criminality, according to official propaganda, was a phenomenon peculiar to decadent capitalist societies, something that simply did not exist in the glorious People's Republic of Poland. Apartments were assigned by the state. Jobs were assigned by the state. Even travel within the country required permits and authorizations that the state granted according to criteria that were never entirely clear. People lived in identical housing blocks, built according to designs approved by bureaucrats in Warsaw, with thin walls that let the neighbors' noises through, with elevators that were frequently broken, with interior courtyards where children played among the hanging laundry and overflowing garbage containers. It was an austere but predictable life, marked by queues to buy basic foodstuffs, by obligatory celebrations of communist holidays, by meetings of neighborhood committees, where each family's political loyalty was subtly monitored. But reality always finds a way to contradict propaganda. And in November 1964, that reality began to manifest itself in the most terrible imaginable way. The air of that autumn was sharp, laden with the humidity rising from the Przemysł, and Brynica rivers, tinged with the sulphurous smell emanating from the industrial chimneys that never rested. On the 7th of November, a date that would soon be etched in the collective memory of an entire region, the lifeless body of a woman was discovered in the Dąbrówka-Mała district, in the suburbs of Katowice. The discovery was made by a worker returning from his night shift, walking along the dirt paths that wound alongside the railway embankments. The man first saw what appeared to be a bundle of abandoned clothes, perhaps empty sacks that some passerby had dropped. He moved closer, drawn by a curiosity that would soon turn to horror. What he found was the body of a woman, lying face up with her eyes open toward a sky that promised rain. Her name was Anna Majcek, and she was 58 years old. She was a working woman, one of many in that region, who dedicated their days to manual labor and their nights to caring for families that depended on every zloty earned with effort. She had left her work that afternoon, walking toward her home along the same path she traveled every day, crossing isolated areas near the railway embankments. It was a route she knew by heart, one she had traversed hundreds of times without incident, never suspecting that this would be the last time her feet would walk that familiar path. No one saw her arrive home, no one heard her screams, if there were any. When they found her, horror seized those who beheld the scene. The crime scene was a silent testimony to a violence that exceeded anything the local investigators had ever seen. Anna had been savagely beaten on the head with a blunt object, a heavy instrument that had impacted against her skull with devastating force. The wounds were concentrated on the back of her head, suggesting that the attacker had approached from behind, striking without warning, giving his victim no chance to defend herself or even to see the face of her killer. It had not been one blow, nor two, but a rain of impacts that had left her face unrecognizable, disfigured by the fury of an attacker who seemed to have lost all vestige of humanity. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy would later describe the injuries as among the most severe he had ever witnessed in his career. The skull had been fractured in multiple places, the brain tissue irreparably damaged by the repeated trauma. Death had likely been instantaneous, or nearly so, but the attacker had not stopped there. The autopsy would reveal that the attacker had struck her multiple times, even after she had already died, continuing the assault on a body that no longer felt pain, as if the act of killing had not been enough to satisfy whatever dark impulse dominated him. This behavior, which criminologists would later call overkill, suggested an attacker driven by rage, by compulsion, by an inner demon that could not be silenced even by the cessation of his victim's life. But that was not all, and what the investigators discovered next chilled their blood in a way that the Polish November cold could not explain. The body had been dragged several meters from the initial attack site, leaving a trail of blood on the flattened grass and wet mud. The killer had taken his time with Anna Majcek, even after killing her. Her coat had been unbuttoned with a meticulousness that contrasted with the violence of the attack. Her skirts had been lifted, her underwear removed and thrown aside. Her genitals were exposed to the cold of that November night, as if the killer had wanted to profane her dignity even after taking her life. There were no signs of rape in the traditional sense, no evidence of sexual penetration, but the manipulation of the body was unmistakably sexual in its intent, a macabre ritual whose meaning the investigators could not yet comprehend. The investigators from the Ministry of Defense, the agency that in communist Poland handled police matters, initiated a routine investigation. At first, suspicions fell on Anna Majcek's husband. It was the usual procedure. When a woman was murdered, the first suspect was always the man closest to her. But while the widower remained in custody, while the interrogators tried to extract a confession that would never come, something unexpected happened. Something that would completely change the nature of the investigation and would plunge an entire region into a state of terror that would last 6 long years. On the 20th of January 1965, barely 2 months after the murder of Anna Micek, another woman appeared dead in frighteningly similar circumstances. Her name was Ewa Pakan, and her body was found in Czelać, a city neighboring Katowice. The similarities to the previous case were too evident to be ignored. Brutal blows to the head with a blunt object, profanation of the corpse, absence of robbery, absence of sexual assault consummated in the traditional sense, but a clear intention to expose and manipulate the body in a way that suggested motivations of a sexual nature on the part of the attacker. And the investigators began to feel a chill that had nothing to do with the Polish winter. Something was happening in that industrial region, something unprecedented in the criminal history of post-war Poland. On the 17th of March 1965, the pattern repeated itself. This time the victim was Lydia Nowaka, murdered in Będzin. And barely 2 months later, on the 14th of May, another woman was attacked in the same city. Her name was Irena Szymańska, and she survived. Badly injured, traumatized, but alive. Her testimony, fragmentary and tinged by shock, provided the first direct clues about the attacker. The man had approached her from behind, without warning, without any attempt at communication. He had struck her with something heavy, probably a metal pipe or an iron bar. She had fallen to the ground, stunned but conscious, and had managed to resist, to scream, to attract the attention of passers-by who came to her aid. The attacker had fled before he could consummate his assault. Irena could not describe him precisely. She had not seen his face clearly, but she was sure of one thing. That man was not seeking her money, nor trying to rape her in the conventional sense. There was something different about his aggression, something ritualistic, something she could not explain, but had perceived even in those seconds of absolute terror. The months that followed brought more attacks, more deaths, more fear. The cities of Zagłębie and Upper Silesia were submerged in a climate of collective hysteria that the authorities were incapable of controlling. Every neighborhood meeting became a forum for sharing rumors and theories, and every workplace canteen buzzed with speculation about the killer's identity. Every family dinner table featured discussions of precautionary measures and escape plans. The women no longer walked alone after dark. They organized themselves into groups, traveling in pairs or threes whenever possible, never straying far from well-lit main streets. Factories organized collective transport to take their female workers home, deploying buses and trucks that would deposit groups of women as close to their apartment blocks as possible. Fathers escorted their daughters on any trip that required crossing deserted streets, no matter how short the distance or how inconvenient the timing. Young men who had once spent their evenings at taverns now found themselves conscripted into escort duty, walking their sisters, girlfriends, and neighbors home from work or school. The police multiplied their patrols, but the attacker seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade all surveillance. He struck and disappeared, leaving behind bodies and terror, as if he could make himself invisible when needed. The investigators studied the patterns of his attacks, trying to predict where he would strike next. But the vampire seemed to choose his hunting grounds at random, or according to a logic that only he could understand. The press, controlled by the state, but still capable of certain freedoms in the coverage of criminal matters, began to speak of an unidentified serial attacker. The official propaganda that had denied the existence of common criminality in socialist society found itself unable to hide a reality that everyone was living, and the newspapers printed articles about the attacks, carefully worded to avoid sensationalism, but still conveying the gravity of the situation. Editors walked a fine line between informing the public and not appearing to criticize the government's inability to protect its citizens. The article spoke of isolated incidents and ongoing investigations, but the frequency of these reports belied any attempt to minimize the threat. The rumors spread faster than any official bulletin. Whispered conversations in queues for bread, hushed exchanges in the courtyards of apartment blocks, fearful discussions among co-workers during smoke breaks. These informal networks of information carried news of each new attack with a speed that no newspaper could match. And with the news came speculation, embellishment, and outright fabrication. When it was said that the attacker was a supernatural creature, a vampire who fed on the blood of his victims, there were those who claimed to have seen a dark figure wandering the streets at night, a shadow that moved with inhuman speed and that vanished when someone tried to approach. Old women who had never forgotten the folk tales of their grandmothers spoke of strigoi and upiri, the undead creatures of Slavic mythology who preyed on the living. The nickname that would define the case forever emerged organically from these rumors: the Zagwembie vampire. The image of the vampire resonated with ancestral fears, with the folklore of Eastern Europe, where tales of undead creatures that fed on the living had been part of the popular imagination for centuries. In the villages and small towns of Poland, grandmothers still told stories of vampires to frighten children into obedience. The undead were said to rise from their graves at night, seeking the blood of the living to sustain their unnatural existence. They could not be seen in mirrors, could not cross running water, were repelled by garlic and holy symbols. They were creatures of darkness, allergic to sunlight, dwelling in the shadows between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These folk beliefs had been officially dismissed by the communist authorities as superstitious remnants of the feudal past, but they persisted in the collective unconscious, surfacing now in the form of a nickname that captured something essential about the terror gripping the region. But the vampire image also served a psychological function, to externalize evil, to attribute it to something inhuman, to distance normal people from the possibility that one of their neighbors, one of their co-workers, someone they might pass on the street every day, could be the monster who was sowing death throughout the region. The vampire was not one of them. He was something other, something from outside, a force of darkness that had descended upon their communities for reasons that perhaps no one would ever understand. This externalization was a defense mechanism, a way of preserving the belief that the world was fundamentally orderly and safe, that the horror was an aberration that would eventually be contained. If the killer was a vampire, a supernatural creature, then ordinary people need not fear ordinary people. If the killer was human, one of them, then the implications were far more disturbing. On the 12th of November 1965, exactly 1 year and 5 days after the first murder, a crime occurred that would elevate the case to the highest echelons of political power. That night, a young woman named Jolanta Gierek was attacked and killed while walking near the railway tracks in Dąbrowa Górnicza. It was a cold evening, and Jolanta was returning home from a social engagement, taking a shortcut through an area that locals knew was somewhat isolated, but that she had traversed many times before without incident. She was young, vibrant, with her whole life ahead of her. She had plans, dreams, the confidence of youth that tells us nothing bad can really happen to us. The attacker emerged from the shadows without warning, striking her down with the same brutal efficiency he had demonstrated in his previous crimes. And her body was found with the same characteristics as the previous victims: brutal blows to the head, manipulation of clothing, exposure of intimate parts, absence of conventional sexual assault. The ritual was unchanged, the signature unmistakable. But Jolanta Gierek was not just another victim. She was the niece of Edward Gierek, who at that time was the first secretary of the Communist Party in Katowice province and one of the most powerful men in all of Poland. A man destined, although no one knew it yet, to become the supreme leader of the country in just a few years. The murder of a relative of such a prominent figure sent shockwaves through the political establishment. This was no longer just a problem for the local police. It was a matter that touched the innermost circles of power. The murder of Jolanta Gierek transformed the investigation. What had been a regional police matter became a national priority. Telephone calls were made to Warsaw. Urgent meetings convened at the highest levels of government. Careers suddenly placed on the line. The message from above was clear. This case must be solved, and it must be solved quickly. Resources that had been unavailable before were suddenly mobilized. Expert investigators were brought in from Warsaw, men with experience in complex criminal cases who carried with them the authority of the central government. Specialized laboratories began to analyze evidence that had previously been processed with rudimentary methods. Forensic scientists who had been assigned to other duties were redirected to focus exclusively on the vampire case. The political pressure on the investigators became immense, a weight that would distort the investigation in ways that would only become apparent decades later. Finding the Zagłębie vampire was no longer just a matter of public safety. It was a matter of political prestige, of demonstrating that the socialist state could protect its citizens, especially those connected to the ruling elite. The failure to catch the killer was now not just an embarrassment for the local police, but a potential stain on the reputation of powerful men who did not tolerate failure. A special task force was created, initially called Anna, after the first victim, Anna Majczek. This was the first time in Polish criminal history that such a specialized unit had been assembled for a single case. The task force was staffed with hand-picked investigators, men who had demonstrated exceptional skills in their previous assignments, and who were now expected to bring all their expertise to bear on the most challenging case of their careers. They worked out of a dedicated office, walls covered with photographs of crime scenes, maps marked with the locations of each attack, charts attempting to find patterns in the chaos of violence. The task force compiled what they called the professional profile of the vampire, a list of 483 characteristics that the killer presumably possessed. This was pioneering work, an early attempt at what would later become known as criminal profiling. They analyzed patterns of attacks, noting the times of day the crimes occurred, the days of the week, the weather conditions. They examined the types of victims selected, looking for commonalities that might reveal the killer's preferences or vulnerabilities. They studied the hours and places of the crimes, creating heat maps of danger zones, and hypothesizing about the killer's likely residence or workplace. They considered the psychological traits that could be inferred from the killer's behavior, consulting with psychiatrists and psychologists who attempted to construct a portrait of the mind behind the murders. From this analysis, a suspect list of 267 men was established. Each of these suspects was investigated in depth, their backgrounds examined, their alibis verified, their movements tracked. It was a Herculean task in an era when databases did not exist, and each verification required hours of manual work, interviews in person, handwritten letters sent to distant authorities. Among the early suspects was a man named Pyotr Olshowy. Olshowy was an artist, a painter who suffered from schizophrenia and who fit several of the characteristics on the task force's profile. He was a solitary figure, known in the neighborhood for his erratic behavior and his intense, sometimes unsettling, artistic visions. His paintings depicted dark themes, images of violence and suffering, that some interpreted as windows into a disturbed mind. When brought in for questioning, Olshowy did not resist. Indeed, he seemed almost eager to confess. During the interrogations, Olshowy confessed to being the Zagłębie vampire. He described several of the crimes in detail, provided information that apparently only the killer could know, and accepted the charges against him with a calm that the interrogators found either reassuring or disturbing, depending on their interpretation. His account of the murders was vivid, graphic, filled with details that seemed to corroborate his guilt. The investigators believed they had found their man. The pressure from above was immediately eased. The nightmare seemed to be over. But when the psychiatric experts examined Olshowy, they concluded that his confession was the product of his mental illness, not an admission of real guilt. Olshowy was prone to confabulation, to inventing stories and believing them himself, to absorbing information from his environment and weaving it into narratives that felt real to him but had no basis in actual experience. His detailed knowledge of the crimes could be explained by rumors circulating through the community, or by information that the interrogators themselves had inadvertently provided during the questioning. His confession was considered unreliable, and he was released, although he remained under surveillance. For the investigators, it was back to square one, with the added humiliation of having announced a breakthrough that had proven to be illusory. The attacks continued. In 1965 alone, there were 11 confirmed attacks attributed to the vampire, of which 5 were fatal. Each new victim added to the weight of dread that had settled over the region like a perpetual fog. The survivors, those women who had somehow lived through the encounters with the killer, provided testimonies that painted a terrifying picture of an attacker who was methodical, swift, and utterly without mercy. He approached from behind, giving no warning, offering no chance for escape or negotiation. He struck with devastating force, aiming always for the head, seeking to incapacitate his victims immediately. And after the initial assault, he would manipulate their bodies in ways that the survivors could barely bring themselves to describe. The women of Zagłębie lived in a state of permanent terror. Every noise in the night could be the vampire approaching. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of wind against a window, every bark of a distant dog, all became potential harbingers of horror. Every male stranger was a potential suspect. Women found themselves scrutinizing the faces of men on trams, in shops, on the streets, wondering if this one or that one could be the monster who had murdered their sisters, their neighbors, their colleagues. Factories changed their schedules to avoid having women leave work after dark, even when this meant accepting reduced productivity and the displeasure of the central planners. Schools organized collective accompaniment so that the girls would not have to walk home alone, with teachers and parents taking turns as escorts. The region had become a prison where half the population, the female half, could not move freely without fearing for their lives. Collective psychosis reached levels that the authorities had never witnessed. Fear did not distinguish social classes or educational levels. Both illiterate factory workers and university professors felt the same visceral fear when night fell. A rumor spread that the vampire had set a goal of killing 1,000 women before the millennium of the Polish state. A celebration that was approaching for 1966, commemorating the 1,000 years since the baptism of Poland and the founding of the Christian Polish state. This rumor, completely unfounded but incredibly persistent, added an almost apocalyptic component to the terror. The number 1,000 resonated with biblical echoes, with the idea of a massive sacrifice that surpassed any historical precedent. The vampire was not just a killer. He was a malevolent force determined to tarnish the nation's glory with a torrent of female blood. Some began to interpret the crimes as divine punishment, a plague sent to punish the sins of a society that had abandoned God under the pressure of the atheist regime. And others saw in the vampire a symbol of everything that was wrong with communist Poland: the dehumanization, the brutality, the state's indifference to the suffering of its citizens. Irrational fear mixed with rational fear, creating an atmosphere in which any suspicious behavior could trigger a panic reaction. Innocent men were attacked by mobs of neighbors who believed they had identified the vampire. A worker returning late from a tavern was chased and beaten by a group of young men, convinced that his erratic behavior marked him as the killer. A street vendor who roamed the neighborhoods offering goods was reported multiple times because his presence in different places made him suspicious. A mentally disabled man who wandered the streets was temporarily arrested after several neighbors swore they had seen him lurking near the crime scenes. In 1966, the rhythm of attacks seemed to decrease slightly. There were fewer murders, although the attacks on survivors continued. Some believed the vampire had left the region, that he had fled to another part of Poland or even abroad. Others thought that police pressure was finally having an effect, that the killer was becoming more cautious, that the omnipresent patrols and the heightened vigilance of the population were forcing him to take fewer risks. There were those who speculated that the vampire had satisfied whatever dark urge drove him, that he had retired from his career of murder as suddenly as he had begun it. Optimists hoped that he had died, perhaps in an accident, perhaps from natural causes, perhaps at his own hand in a moment of guilt or despair. But the respite was temporary, a false dawn that only made the resumption of violence more devastating. In 1967 and 1968, the attacks resumed with renewed fury. The vampire seemed to be taunting the authorities, demonstrating that despite all their resources, despite all their investigations, despite all their patrols and checkpoints and undercover officers, he remained beyond their reach. Each new attack was a slap in the face to the investigators, a reminder of their impotence, a declaration that the vampire would continue his work according to his own schedule, not theirs. The morale of the task force began to crumble. Officers who had dedicated years of their lives to the case started to doubt whether they would ever succeed. Some requested transfers to other units, unable to bear the weight of failure any longer. Others developed drinking problems, their nights haunted by images of crime scenes they could not forget. The case was grinding down the very men who were supposed to solve it. By 1969, the investigators were desperate. 5 years had passed since the first murder, and they were no closer to capturing the killer than they had been at the beginning. The pressure from superiors was unbearable. Careers were at stake. The political credibility of the entire security apparatus was in question. It was in this context that attention began to focus on a particular suspect, a man who had appeared on the original list of 267, but who had not been thoroughly investigated until then. His name was Zdzisław Marchwicki. On the 4th of March 1970, another victim was added to the grim list. Jadwiga Kuchanka, a respected literary critic and intellectual, who collaborated with the Silesian Literary Review, was murdered while walking through the streets of Bytom. Her death represented a turning point, not only because of her social status, but because of the circumstances that followed. 3 days later, the militia received an anonymous letter. The content was brief, but chilling. That was the last murder. There will be no more, and they will never catch me. The sender did not identify himself, but the tone of the letter suggested it had been written by the vampire himself. And then, on the night of the 14th to 15th of March, something happened that shook the investigators to their foundations. In Sosnowiec, Piotr Olszowy, the same man who had confessed to being the vampire and then been released, murdered his wife and 2 children with hammer blows. The violence occurred in the darkness of their family apartment, in those hours when the world is most still and most vulnerable. His wife died first, then his children, their young lives extinguished before they could understand what was happening. After committing that family massacre, Olszowy doused the house with gasoline, soaking the furniture, the walls, the bodies of his victims. He soaked himself with the fuel, then lit a match. The explosion of flames transformed the apartment into an inferno that lit up the night sky. When the firefighters managed to extinguish the flames and recover the bodies, they found the charred remains of Olszowy next to his family's corpses. And the fire had been so intense that it was impossible to obtain fingerprints from the calcined body. It could never be known with certainty whether those prints matched those found at the locations where the vampire had attacked. The death of Olszowy plunged the investigators into utter confusion. Had he been the true vampire? The letter the militia had received promising there would be no more murders, had it been written by Olszowy before his suicide? The temporal coincidence was too striking to ignore. The last murder attributed to the vampire, that of Kuchanka, had occurred on the 4th of March. The letter arrived on the 11th, and Olszowy died on the 15th. If he was the vampire, then the case was closed, though in the most unsatisfactory way imaginable. But if he was not, then the real killer was still free, and the letter could have been a cruel mockery, a gesture of triumph from a psychopath who had managed to evade justice. The authorities found themselves facing an impossible dilemma. They had no conclusive proof of Olszowy's guilt, but neither could they rule him out completely. And meanwhile, the pressure to close the case remained overwhelming. The population demanded answers. The politicians demanded results. The entire system needed to demonstrate that it could protect its citizens from threats like the Zagłębie vampire. Almost 2 years passed without new attacks, attributed to the vampire being recorded. For many, this seemed to confirm that Olszowy had indeed been the killer. But for the investigators, especially those who had developed their own theories about the case, the absence of new crimes was not enough to consider the matter concluded. The militia had implemented during those years of terror a series of unprecedented operations in Polish police history. 100 female militia officers were recruited to act as decoys, patrolling the lonely streets of the affected cities with helmets hidden under scarves and shawls, prepared to confront the vampire if he appeared. It was a risky strategy, exposing these brave women to the same danger that ordinary citizens faced, but one the authorities considered necessary given the absence of other viable leads. None of these undercover officers managed to spot the killer, which suggested that the vampire was extremely cautious, capable of distinguishing potential traps, or that he had simply stopped acting. The number of patrols on the streets had multiplied. Checkpoints had been established on the main access routes to the cities, and still the vampire had managed to evade capture for 6 years. Among those who refused to give up was Captain Jerzy Gruber, who had led the investigation since 1965, and whose career depended largely on the satisfactory resolution of the case. Gruber remained convinced that there was a more promising suspect than Olsowy, a man who appeared on the list of 267, and whose profile fit better with the established characteristics of the vampire. That man was Zdzisław Marchwicki. In November 1971, the investigation took a definitive turn when the militia received a letter signed by Maria Marchwicki, Zdzisław's wife. In that letter, Maria accused her husband of systematically abusing her and their children. She described episodes of domestic violence, physical abuse, and sadistic behavior that had converted their home into a place of constant fear and suffering. She spoke of beatings that left her bruised for weeks, of psychological torment that had eroded her sense of self, of sexual practices that she had endured against her will. The picture she painted was of a monster hiding behind the mask of an ordinary working man, a predator whose true nature only his family had witnessed. But Maria went beyond reporting domestic violence. In her letter, she claimed that her husband was the Zagłębie vampire, the killer who had terrorized an entire region for 6 years. She provided details that she claimed proved his guilt, while described objects she had found in their home that matched descriptions of items taken from victims, recounted conversations in which he had allegedly confessed his crimes to her. The letter was a bombshell, the breakthrough that the investigators had been waiting for. But questions would later be raised about Maria's motivations. Was she a courageous woman finally speaking out against an abuser and killer? Or was she a bitter spouse using the vampire investigation as a weapon in a domestic conflict, making accusations she knew could not be verified against a man she wanted to destroy? The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes, or it may be something else entirely. The investigators did not pause to consider these questions. They needed a suspect, and Maria had given them one. On the 6th of January 1972, militia agents appeared at the Marchwicki home in Dąbrowa Górnicza and arrested Zdzisław. According to some testimonies, when the agents entered the house, Marchwicki uttered words that seemed to confirm his guilt. "Have you come in 2 Volgas just for one person? How many of you are there? No more, no less. The vampire has been caught." Other testimonies collected in the judicial archives cite him as simply saying, "Well, at last, the vampire has been captured." Whatever the exact version of his words, for many of those present that night, the implicit confession was sufficient. They had found the monster. Zdzisław Marchwicki had been born on the 18th of October, 1927, in Dąbrowa Górnicza, the city that years later would become the epicenter of the vampire's terror. And he came into a world that was already marked by instability and hardship, a world where the economic difficulties of interwar Poland cast long shadows over working-class families. He came from a dysfunctional family. His father, Józef, had married 5 times and had 4 children from different marriages, 3 sons and a daughter. The household was chaotic, marked by the comings and goings of stepmothers, by the rivalries between half-siblings, by the absences of a father who seemed incapable of maintaining a stable family life. Zdzisław grew up in an environment of instability, poverty, and violence. He learned early that the world was a harsh place, that affection was scarce and unreliable, that a man had to look out for himself because no one else would, and he showed little interest in studies and dropped out of school without graduating. The teachers who remembered him, when later asked by investigators, described a quiet boy, neither particularly bright nor particularly troublesome, someone who had passed through the educational system without leaving much of an impression. During World War II, he was sent as a forced laborer to farms in Prudnik in Upper Silesia. He was still an adolescent when the war began, and the years that should have been devoted to growing up normally were instead spent under the heel of Nazi occupation. According to the memoirs he would later write in prison, it was during that period of forced labor that his perverted tendencies first manifested. He was caught committing an act of zoophilia by the owner of the farm where he worked, and as a result was arrested and beaten by the Gestapo and sent to the Blechhammer concentration camp. The horrors he witnessed and experienced in that camp would never be fully documented, but the psychological impact of such an experience on a young man can hardly be overstated. He managed to survive the war and returned to his hometown, where he worked in various occupations related to the metallurgical industry. He married Maria and had several children. In the eyes of his neighbors, he was an ordinary man, just another worker in the industrial basin, someone who went unnoticed in the gray crowd of the working-class cities. But behind that facade of normality, according to the version of the prosecution that would later prosecute him, hid a methodical and ruthless predator. The investigators who believed in his guilt pointed to multiple circumstantial elements linking him to the crimes. All the murders had occurred in places Marchwicki knew, areas where he had worked or where he had acquaintances. He lived near the place where the first victim, Anna Majcek, had been murdered, and apparently his mother-in-law had had a dispute with her in the past. In his home were found objects that supposedly belonged to some of the victims, although the chain of custody of this evidence would later be questioned. A large whip was also found, allegedly used for sadomasochistic practices, which was presented as one of the weapons of the crimes. Marchwicki had a police record for minor offenses, thefts, fights, antisocial behavior. He was known for his violent temperament and for abusing his family, and he suffered from horizontal nystagmus, an involuntary movement of the eyes that, according to some witnesses, gave him a particularly disturbing appearance when he was agitated, showing only the white part of his eyes. Marchwicki's arrest was not the end, but the beginning of a long and tortuous process. The interrogations went on for months, conducted in the grey rooms of militia headquarters, where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of fear. Marchwicki denied his participation in the murders from the first moment, but his behavior during the interrogations was described as strange and inconsistent. He was combative at times, passive at others. He would answer questions in ways that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. At times he spoke of supposedly unrevealed crimes, confusing the investigators, hinting at dark deeds that had never been attributed to the vampire. Was he taunting them? Was he confused? Was he simply trying to give them what he thought they wanted to hear? No one could be certain. When presented with documents to sign, he wrote at the bottom of the protocols that it was all lies. He scratched annotations in the margins, protesting his innocence in a hand that was barely legible. At one point he even tried to swallow one of the documents, stuffing the paper into his mouth before the guards could restrain him. For investigators convinced of his guilt, this behavior was evidence that he was trying to hide something, that the consciousness of his terrible crimes was driving him to desperate and irrational acts. For those who doubted, and it was simply the response of a terrified man who did not fully understand what was happening. A man of limited education and intelligence, who found himself caught in a legal machinery he could not comprehend. The decision to charge Marchwicki was not based solely on his confession or on the material evidence found in his home. A crucial role was played by testimonies from his own family. Maria Marchwicki, the wife who had denounced him, maintained her accusations and expanded them during the months following the arrest. She appeared at the militia headquarters multiple times, adding new details to her story, identifying new objects as having belonged to victims, remembering new conversations in which her husband had implicated himself. Her testimony was detailed, consistent, and damning. But even more damaging were the declarations of Marchwicki's son, also named Zdzisław, and his daughter, who testified that their father had confessed to them his crimes, that he had shown them objects taken from the victims, that he had detailed his macabre methods with a pride that still horrified them when they remembered it. The impact of children testifying against their own father was enormous. If his own flesh and blood, the people who knew him best, believed him capable of these horrors, then surely he must be guilty. The court gave great weight to these testimonies, seeing in them the most intimate possible confirmation of the prosecutor's case. These testimonies would later be contested. After Marchwicki's conviction, his children retracted their statements, claiming they had been coerced by their mother and by the pressure of the interrogators. They said that Maria had subjected them to emotional blackmail, threatening them with consequences if they did not collaborate in the conviction of their father. They said that the interrogators had suggested the answers they expected to hear, had led them through the testimonies with questions that contained their own answers, had held them in detention for extended periods. They said they were promised benefits if they testified in the expected direction, and threatened with punishment if they did not. The retractions came too late. Marchwicki had already been convicted and executed. His children would spend the rest of their lives carrying the burden of having contributed to their father's death, uncertain whether their original testimonies or their later retractions reflected the truth. The trial began on the 18th of September, 1974, more than 2 years after Marchwicki's initial arrest. The venue chosen was the club of the Zakłady Cinkowe Silesia factory in Katowice, a space large enough to accommodate the extraordinary public interest that the case had generated. The facilities had been adapted for the occasion, with benches arranged in rows that could hold hundreds of spectators, with tables for the lawyers and prosecutors, with a raised platform where the court would preside over the sessions. Due to the notoriety of the proceedings, only those who had acquired special tickets were allowed entry, as if it were a theatrical spectacle and not a judicial procedure. Tickets sold out every day, and long queues formed in the early morning hours in front of the building, with people willing to wait hours in the rain or cold to witness the trial of the century. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, charged with a mixture of expectation, morbid curiosity, and desire for justice that was almost palpable. Journalists from all over Poland, and even some foreign correspondents, occupied the front rows, taking notes frantically as the testimonies succeeded one another. The presiding judge was Władysław Ochman, and the prosecutors were Józef Gurgul and Zenon Kopinski, 2 men who had dedicated years of their careers to building the case against Marchwicki. Marchwicki was defended by attorneys Bolesław Andrysiak and Mieczysław Frelich, both recognized figures of the Polish bar, who faced the almost impossible task of defending a man whom public opinion had already condemned. The main defendant faced 23 charges, the most serious of which were 14 murders and 7 attempted murders. The trial was a prolonged and exhausting battle. Testimonies succeeded one another for months, painting a complex and contradictory picture. Marchwicky's wife testified against him, describing years of abuse and sadistic behavior. His children also testified, although it would later be revealed that their statements had been coerced by their mother. Circumstantial witnesses placed Marchwicky in the vicinity of some of the crime scenes. Forensic experts presented analyses of the scenes, of the weapons allegedly used, of the patterns of the attacker's behavior. But there were also testimonies that contradicted the official version. None of the women who had survived the vampire's attacks identified Marchwicky as their attacker. The fingerprints found at the crime scenes did not match Marchwicky's. Some experts questioned whether the whip found in his home could have caused the injuries described in the autopsy reports. They considered it too soft to inflict such severe traumas. And a crucial piece of data seemed to contradict the identification of Marchwicky as the vampire. The attacker, according to analyses of the scenes, was left-handed, but Marchwicky was right-handed. Deep divisions emerged within the investigative team. Some, led by General Gruber, were convinced of Marchwicky's guilt and pushed for a conviction. They pointed to the circumstantial evidence, to the timing of the attacks, to the objects found in his home, to the testimonies of his wife and children. For them, the case was clear enough, and the gaps in the evidence could be explained by the limitations of the forensic technology available at the time, and by the inherent difficulty of proving crimes that had occurred in darkness without witnesses, by an attacker who took precautions to avoid leaving traces. Others, among them Colonels Zygmunt Kalis and Stefan Tokars, Lieutenant Zbigniew Gontarz, and Prosecutor Leszek Polański, harbored serious doubts. They had spent years working on the case, knew its details intimately, and could not ignore the inconsistencies that troubled them. They believed the evidence was insufficient, that the case had been built on fragile foundations, that political pressure had distorted the investigation in ways that would be difficult to undo. The fingerprint evidence troubled them deeply. In a case where the killer had left prints at multiple crime scenes, the inability to match those prints to Marchwicky should have been disqualifying. The handedness question troubled them as well. All the evidence suggested a left-handed attacker, yet Marchwicky was demonstrably right-handed. And the lack of positive identification by any survivor troubled them most of all. These women had seen the vampire, had looked into his face, had survived to tell their stories, and none of them recognized Marchwicky as their attacker. These dissenters were known informally as the Kalisani, a nickname derived from Colonel Kalis's name. Their objections were ignored or minimized, and they were accused of obstructing justice, of having personal vendettas against Gruber, of failing to see the forest for the trees. The system needed a culprit, and Marchwicky was the available candidate. Piotr Olsowy, the other viable suspect, had committed suicide taking his secrets to the grave. If Marchwicky was not convicted, who would answer for the 14 murders that had terrorized an entire region for 6 years? How would the state justify its inability to protect its female citizens? On the 28th of July 1975, after a process that had lasted almost a year, the court issued its verdict. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air heavy with anticipation, and the accumulated tension of months of testimony. Journalists clutched their notebooks, ready to record the moment that would make headlines across Poland. Families of the victims sat in the gallery, some weeping quietly, others staring at the defendant with expressions of undisguised hatred. And Marchwicky himself sat in the dock, looking older and more haggard than when the trial had begun, the toll of the proceedings visible in the deep lines of his face and the hollow look in his eyes. Zdzisław Marchwicki was found guilty of 14 murders and 6 attempted murders, and sentenced to death. The words fell from the judge's mouth with the weight of finality, each syllable a hammer blow that sealed a man's fate. His brother Jan Marczewski also received the death penalty for his role in the murder of Jadwiga Kuchanka. Henryk Marczewski was sentenced to 25 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Józef Klimczak received 12 years. Halina Flak and her son Zdzisław Flak were sentenced to 4 years each. She for receiving objects stolen from the victims, he for failing to report the crimes of which he had knowledge. When the judge read the sentence, Marczewski remained impassive. According to some observers present in the courtroom, he seemed resigned, like a man who had accepted his fate long before it was officially pronounced. Others thought they detected a flicker of defiance, a silent protest against a verdict he believed to be unjust. The truth of what he felt in that moment would die with him. Appeals were filed and rejected. Clemency petitions were denied. The Polish judicial system, as it functioned under the communist regime, left no room for doubt or for critical review of verdicts. The defense attorneys exhausted all available legal avenues, presenting arguments that pointed to the contradictions in the evidence, the lack of positive identifications, the procedural irregularities. But the Supreme Court upheld the sentence, and the Council of State rejected the petition for clemency. Zdzisław Marczewski's fate was sealed. On the 26th of April, 1977, at 9 o'clock in the evening, in the midst of a spring that was just beginning to warm the air of Silesia, Zdzisław Marczewski was executed by hanging in a specially prepared garage in the Katowice police complex. The official witnesses, a small group of officials and forensic doctors, watched as the executioner performed his function with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized all acts of the communist state. An hour later, in another garage of the same complex, his brother Jan met the same fate. According to official protocols, both executions were carried out without incident. The condemned men were declared dead by the doctor present, and the bodies were removed for immediate burial. The bodies were buried in graves, marked only by numbers, in a special cemetery for executed criminals, a place without name or public signage, where the state deposited those it considered unworthy of a normal burial. Zdzisław's grave bore the number 39 and was located next to that of another serial killer, Bogdan Arnold. In 1997, after the abolition of the death penalty in Poland, that cemetery was destroyed by decree of President Alexander Kwaśniewski, and the remains were exhumed and deposited in unknown locations, erasing even the last physical trace of those men whose lives the state had ended. The execution of the Marczewski brothers put an official end to the Zagłębie vampire case. For the authorities, the case was closed. The monster had been captured, tried, and executed. Justice had prevailed. The newspapers printed triumphant headlines celebrating the end of an era of terror. The officials who had worked on the case received commendations and promotions. The public was reassured that the socialist state, despite the setbacks and delays, had ultimately proven capable of protecting its citizens. Captain Jerzy Gruber, the main architect of the investigation, rose rapidly through the police hierarchy. Shortly after the conclusion of the case, he was named provincial commander of the militia in Katowice. He would later become deputy general commander of the Polish militia, reaching the rank of general. His career had taken off on the foundations of the vampire case, and he would spend the rest of his professional life reaping the rewards of that success. Whether those rewards were deserved whether the success was genuine, were questions that would only be asked after his power had waned. For the population of Zagłębie and Upper Silesia, Marczewicki's execution meant a return to normalcy, or at least to a version of normalcy that still bore the scars of the years of terror. Women once again walked the streets without the constant fear of being attacked, although many retained habits of caution that would never fully fade. Fathers stopped escorting their daughters, though some continued to worry every time their children left the house after dark. Factories suspended their collective night transports, though the memories of why those transports had been necessary lingered in the minds of those who had lived through those years. The shadow of the vampire had dissipated, or so it seemed. But the doubts never completely disappeared. Even during the trial, even while Marczewicki waited in his cell for the moment of execution, there were those who questioned the solidity of the case. With the passing of years, those dissenting voices grew stronger. In the 1990s, after the fall of communism in Poland, information began to emerge that called into question the legitimacy of the verdict. It was revealed that Zdzisław Marczewicki had never pleaded guilty to the crimes. Throughout the investigation, throughout the trial, throughout his imprisonment and his final days, he maintained his innocence. He never admitted to being the Zagłębie vampire, and never confessed to a single murder, never accepted responsibility for any of the horrors attributed to him. The confessions that had supposedly been obtained during the interrogations were, according to some sources, the product of extreme psychological pressure and manipulation. Marczewicki had been held in isolation, deprived of sleep, subjected to relentless questioning that went on for hours and days, without pause. The interrogators had used techniques that would today be recognized as coercive, techniques designed to break a suspect's will rather than to discover the truth. The diary he supposedly wrote in prison, detailing the murders with minute precision, was exposed as a fabrication. A cellmate, acting under instructions from the prison officers, had dictated the content to Marczewicki, who could barely read and write. This cellmate, a criminal serving his own sentence, had been promised reduced punishment in exchange for his cooperation. He had provided Marczewicki with details about the crimes that had been fed to him by the investigators, details that Marczewicki then transcribed into the diary that would be presented at trial as proof of his guilt. The literary style of the diary, with complex sentences and police jargon, was incompatible with the educational level of a man who had dropped out of school early and whom psychologists had evaluated as having low average intelligence. A man who struggled to sign his own name could not have composed the elaborate narrative of violence and perversion that the diary contained. The fingerprints were another crucial point that has fueled doubts for decades. At none of the crime scenes were fingerprints found that matched Marczewicki's. The forensic technicians who processed the crime locations recovered multiple fingerprint impressions, some clear and others partial, some on surfaces the killer had probably touched, and others that could belong to passers-by or witnesses who approached the bodies before the police arrived. The most promising impressions, those that by their location and clarity seemed to belong to the attacker, were meticulously compared with Marczewicki's prints after his arrest. The comparison was negative. The lines, arches, and whorls of the prints found at the scenes did not match the patterns of Marczewicki's fingers. This data, potentially exculpatory, was minimized during the trial and practically ignored in the sentence. The prosecution argued that the absence of a match proved nothing, that the killer might have worn gloves on some occasions, that the prints could belong to other people unrelated to the crimes. But for critics of the verdict, the absence of positive identifications represented an insurmountable evidentiary gap. How could a man be sentenced to death when the most direct physical evidence, The fingerprints left by the killer at multiple crime scenes did not point to him as the perpetrator. It was also significant that none of the attack survivors identified Marchwicki as their attacker. The women who had managed to survive the blows, who had seen the vampire even if only briefly, were called to testify during the investigation and trial. When shown his photograph or asked to point him out in a lineup, none of them recognized him, and some said they could not be sure, that everything had happened very fast, that the trauma had erased the details from their memory. Others were more categorical. The man who had attacked them was not Marchwicki. They were sure of it, even if they could not explain why. This fact was explained by the prosecution, arguing that the attacks had been so quick and traumatic that the victims had not been able to see their attacker clearly, that the darkness of the streets had prevented adequate observation, that shock had distorted their memories. But for critics of the verdict, the absence of positive identifications represented another piece of the puzzle that did not fit the picture of guilt the prosecution was trying to construct. An even darker theory suggested that the entire investigation was contaminated from the beginning by political interests. Jan Marchwicki was a collaborator of the security services, an informant who operated under the codename Janusz, providing information about his co-workers, his neighbors, anyone who might be of interest to the repressive apparatus of the communist state. His connection to the repressive structure of the Polish state could have complicated the investigation in ways that were never fully transparent. Declassified documents after the fall of communism revealed that Jan had been providing information to the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, the Polish secret police, for years. His position in the administration of the Faculty of Law at the University of Silesia allowed him to observe professors and students, may identify those who might harbor anti-communist sentiments, report suspicious conversations. He was a minor cog in the state's surveillance machinery, but a useful cog that the system did not want to lose. Some speculated that Zdzisław's conviction was a convenient way to eliminate Jan, whose activities as an informant had generated internal conflicts in the security services, without having to publicly reveal his role as a collaborator. By accusing both brothers of participating in the murder of Kuchanka, the authorities could dispose of a troublesome informant while appearing to administer justice for the vampire's crimes. Others suggested that the Marchwicki family was sacrificed to satisfy the demands for justice of powerful political figures like Edward Gierek, whose niece had been one of the victims. Gierek, who shortly after the crimes would rise to the highest political power in Poland as first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, would have pressured for a culprit to be found at any cost. His political prestige depended in part on demonstrating that he could protect his own, that his niece's murder would not go unpunished. These theories were never proven, but they contributed to feeding the perception that the trial had been a political setup, a spectacle designed to calm public opinion rather than establish the truth. The intersection between common criminality and political machinations turned the vampire case into a symbol of the distortions that the communist system introduced into all aspects of public life, including the administration of justice, for the victims of the Zagłębie vampire, whoever the true killer was. The passage of time has not erased the suffering. 14 women lost their lives in brutal, unexpected, absurd fashion. Their names deserve to be spoken with respect. Their stories deserve to be remembered as something more than mere entries in a criminal file. Anna Majcek, the first known victim, was 58 years old and had a life marked by hard work and dedication to her family. Ewa Pakan, just a few months later, became the confirmation that a serial killer was operating in the region. Lydia Nowaka left behind a devastated family that would never understand why, their daughter, their sister, their wife, had been chosen to die in that way. Jolanta Gierek, whose surname linked her to power, but whose death demonstrated that the vampire respected no social hierarchy. Jadwiga Kuchanka, and a respected intellectual, whose contribution to Silesian literature was cut short by a violence that did not distinguish between factory workers and professors. And 9 other women whose names are rarely mentioned in journalistic accounts, but who were equally victims of incomprehensible cruelty. Each of them had dreams they could not fulfill, words they could not speak, embraces they could not give. Each one left a void in the hearts of those who loved them, a void that no judicial sentence, no execution, no passage of time can fill. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives. They were factory workers, returning exhausted from shifts at the factories, with hands hardened by work and feet swollen from hours of standing next to the machines. They were students walking toward their homes, dreaming of a future that would never come, with exams to pass, loves to live, adventures to discover. They were professors crossing the city to attend academic engagements, carrying in their bags the books and notes that defined their intellectual passions. Their lives were cut short by a violence that still seems incomprehensible today, by an attacker who reduced them to objects of his dark impulses, who erased with a blow everything they had been and everything they could have become. Their families bore the grief, the trauma, the unanswered questions. The parents who buried their daughters before their time, inverting the natural order of generations, lived the rest of their days with a pain that never fully abated. The husbands who returned to empty homes, who slept alone in beds they had once shared, who prepared dinners for one person when they had once cooked for 2. The children who grew up without mothers, who asked where mommy was and received answers they could never fully understand, who carried throughout their childhood and adolescence the weight of an absence that was not like other absences. And 7 more women survived the attacks, but carried with them the physical and psychological scars of those assaults for the rest of their days. Their heads bore the marks of the blows, scars that hair could hide, but that fingers found when they ran their hands through their scalps. Their minds held images that no passage of time could erase, the sound of footsteps approaching from behind, the whistle of the blunt object slicing through the air, the impact that knocked them to the ground, the darkness that enveloped them as they fought to survive. Some never fully recovered their health. The brain injuries caused by the traumas left permanent sequelae, chronic headaches, memory problems, concentration difficulties. Others lived tormented by memories they could not erase, by the sound of footsteps behind them in the darkness, by the terror that resurged every time they crossed a lonely street. The vampire had stolen something more than their physical well-being. He had stolen their ability to feel safe in a world that had suddenly revealed itself as a place where horror could strike without warning. In recent decades, forensic analysis techniques have advanced exponentially. DNA, the genetic fingerprint that was beyond the reach of investigators in the 60s, has become a fundamental tool for solving old crimes and exonerating the wrongfully convicted. Cases that seemed unsolvable have found answers decades later thanks to the analysis of biological samples preserved in police archives. Men who spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit have been freed when DNA proved that someone else was the real culprit. This forensic revolution has also reached Poland, where several historical cases have been reviewed in light of new technologies. Do biological samples from the vampire's crime scene still exist that could be analyzed with modern technology? Are there preserved garments from the victims, objects found at the attack sites, physical evidence that could contain genetic material from the true killer? If such samples exist and could be compared with the DNA of known suspects, the mystery that has tormented the region for nearly 6 decades could be definitively solved. Among Marchwiki's children, who continue to fight for their father's rehabilitation, have requested precisely this: that DNA analysis be performed on any evidence that may have been preserved, that modern science have the opportunity to confirm or refute the 1975 verdict. But it is likely that half a century of poor storage, of destruction of archives during the political changes of the 80s and 90s, of institutional negligence in the preservation of evidence, has forever erased the possibility of a scientific closure to the case. The laboratories that processed the original evidence no longer exist. The technicians who handled the samples have died or retired. The preservation protocols used at that time were rudimentary compared to current standards, and the answer to the question of who the Zagwembia vampire really was may have been irretrievably lost in time, along with the charred bodies of Olshowi, the unmarked graves of the Marchwiki brothers, and the memories of witnesses who are no longer alive to tell. What remains, then, is the fragmentary memory, the competing narratives, the divergent interpretations of a past that resists being fully understood, a past that continues to generate passionate debates among those who study it. What remains is the pain of the victims' families, who never had absolute certainty that the right man was punished, who celebrated Marchwiki's execution, believing that justice had been done, but who now wonder if their pain was instrumentalized to condemn an innocent man. What remains is the anguish of the Marchwiki family, who bear the stigma of a surname forever associated with the most atrocious crimes in contemporary Polish history, but who at the same time harbor the suspicion that their father, brother, husband was the victim of a monumental injustice. What remains are the streets of Zagłębie, transformed but still recognizable, where every so often someone points to an alley saying, "That's where they found one of them." What remains is the literature, the documentaries, the journalistic investigations that keep alive the interest in a case that refuses to be forgotten. And what remains, above all, is the question that floats over all the protagonists of this tragedy, victims and perpetrators, investigators and witnesses, condemned and judges. What is justice when we cannot be certain of the truth? And the history of the Zagłębie vampire does not end with Marchwicki's execution, nor with the posthumous rehabilitations that his descendants seek. It does not end because each generation revisits it with new questions, new tools, new perspectives. Criminologists study it to understand the evolution of investigative techniques, analyzing the successes and errors of an investigation that developed without the resources we now consider indispensable. Historians examine it as an example of the pathologies of the Polish communist system, a system that prioritized the appearance of effectiveness over the genuine search for truth, that sacrificed individuals on the altar of political interests, that corrupted even the institutions supposedly dedicated to justice. And jurists analyze it as a paradigmatic case of the safeguards necessary in every judicial process, extracting lessons about the importance of the presumption of innocence, of the right to an effective defense, of the obligation to prove guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Psychologists attempt to reconstruct the profile of the real killer, whether Marchwicki, Olshowi, or an unknown third party, applying methodologies developed decades after the crimes to try to understand the mind that could have conceived and executed those acts of extreme violence. Documentary filmmakers recreated for audiences who were not born when the crimes occurred, using archival footage, interviews with survivors, and dramatizations to convey the horror of those years to viewers who can only imagine what it meant to live under the shadow of the vampire. And ordinary people, the inhabitants of Zagłębie and all of Poland, remember it as part of their collective history, as a dark chapter that partly defines who they are and where they come from. As a reminder that even the most organized societies can fail in their mission to protect the most vulnerable. The region that was the scene of these crimes has changed enormously since the 60s and 70s. The coal mines that defined the economy of Zagłębie and Upper Silesia have closed or drastically reduced their operations, victims of the economic transition that followed the fall of communism and of the global competition that has made many traditional exploitations unviable. The extraction towers that once dominated the horizon have been dismantled or converted into industrial monuments, testimony to an era that no longer exists. And the steel mills that lit up the night sky with their flames have been modernized or have disappeared, and the air of the cities is now cleaner than it has been in decades. The working-class cities have been transformed into more diversified urban centers, with universities that attract students from all over Poland, with shopping centers where families spend weekends, with parks and green spaces where children play without suspecting the horrors that those same streets witnessed half a century ago. The housing blocks built in the communist era still stand, although many have been renovated with colorful facades that try to erase the gray monotony of their original design. The streets have been repaved. The streetlights have been replaced by LED lighting systems. Security cameras watch corners that once only darkness guarded. Almost the men and women who lived through the terror of the vampire are now elderly, their bodies bent by the weight of years, their memories sometimes clouded by age, but at other moments painfully clear. Many have already died, taking with them memories that no one else can recover. But among those who survive, the memory persists with an intensity that defies the passage of time. The oldest can narrate what it was like to walk the streets in those years, the fear they felt at nightfall, the precautions they took to protect their daughters, the way terror transformed every aspect of daily life. Some keep yellowed newspaper clippings documenting the crimes and the trial, stored in boxes alongside family photographs and other treasures from the past. Others prefer not to talk about the subject, as if mentioning it could summon again the shadows of that terrible past, as if silence were the only protection against memories that still hurt after so much time. In the criminal historiography of Poland, the Zagłębie vampire case occupies a singular place. It was the first of a series of serial killer cases that would shake the country in the following decades, as if Marczewicki's capture had opened a gate that allowed the recognition of the existence of this type of criminal in Polish society. Before the vampire, the very concept of a serial killer was foreign to Polish criminology. The official ideology held that such monsters were products of decadent Western societies, that they could not exist in a socialist nation where alienation and individualism had been overcome. The vampire shattered that illusion, forcing the authorities to acknowledge that Poland was not immune to the darkest aspects of human nature. Joachim Kniszawa, known as the Bytom vampire, terrorized that city in the 70s, clearly inspired by the crimes of the Zagłębie vampire. He adopted a similar modus operandi, attacking women in isolated locations, using blunt force trauma to incapacitate his victims, manipulating their bodies in ways that suggested sexual motivation. The very nickname he acquired, the Bytom vampire, was a direct reference to his predecessor, as if the original vampire had spawned a lineage of terror. Leszek Pękalski, the Bajtov vampire, operated in the 80s and 90s, with a number of victims that some estimate even greater than the original case. His reign of terror lasted far longer than the Zagłębie vampires, in part because he operated in a more rural area, where the pattern of his crimes was harder to detect. These later killers were investigated and tried with more sophisticated methodologies, benefiting from technological advances such as DNA analysis and computerized databases, as well as from the lessons learned from the errors of the Marchwicki case. The mistakes made during the Zagłębie investigation became case studies in police academies, cautionary tales about the dangers of tunnel vision, confirmation bias, and political pressure on criminal investigations, but none of them reached the level of notoriety and social impact that the Zagłębie vampire had generated. He was the first, the archetype, the name that defined a category of criminal that communist propaganda had insisted on denying. The figure of the vampire has also become a symbol of the contradictions of the Polish communist system. A regime that claimed to have eliminated bourgeois criminality, that affirmed it had created a society free from the vices of capitalism, was incapable of protecting its female citizens from a predator who acted for 6 years with almost total impunity. The propagandists had insisted for decades that crime was a product of class inequality, of the alienation inherent in capitalist exploitation, of the moral bankruptcy of societies organized around private profit rather than collective welfare. In the socialist utopia they were supposedly building, there would be no crime because there would be no motive for crime. Everyone would have their needs met, everyone would have meaningful work, and everyone would be integrated into a community that cared for all its members. And yet, here was the vampire, stalking the streets of one of the most industrialized regions of the socialist paradise, murdering women whose only crime was walking home from work. A judicial system that proclaimed its commitment to socialist justice may have sentenced an innocent man to death, sacrificing him on the altar of political convenience. The principles that should have guided the courts, presumption of innocence, burden of proof, protection of the accused, were subordinated to the need to produce a result, to demonstrate that the state was capable and efficient, to satisfy the demands of powerful political figures whose relatives had been among the victims. A police force that presented itself as the defender of the working people was capable of fabricating evidence, coercing testimonies, ignoring exculpatory evidence, all in order to produce a result that would satisfy the higher authorities. The investigators who voiced doubts were silenced or marginalized, their objections recorded in files that would only be opened decades later, after the regime that had suppressed them had collapsed. The Zagłębie vampire case is, in this sense, a window into the structural dysfunctions of a regime that would collapse definitively less than 15 years after Marchwicki's execution. It reveals how the pressures of an authoritarian system can distort even the pursuit of justice, how the need to maintain appearances can override the search for truth, how institutions designed to protect citizens can instead become instruments of their oppression. But perhaps some enigmas are not meant to be solved. Perhaps the Zagłębie vampire case will forever remain an unsolved mystery, a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and of evil's capacity to escape the accountability that justice demands. The police files still contain contradictions that no investigator has managed to reconcile. The testimonies of witnesses remain irreconcilable on crucial points. The fingerprints still do not match those of the man who was executed for the crimes. If so, the only thing we can do is remember the victims with the respect they deserve, critically analyze the failures of the system that should have protected them from a predator who operated for 6 years without being stopped, and extract from this tragedy the necessary lessons to prevent something similar from happening again in the future. But beyond the political and legal implications, the case poses deeper questions about the nature of evil, about the human capacity to inflict suffering on fellow beings, about the psychological mechanisms that can transform an apparently ordinary man into a ruthless killer. The psychologists and criminologists who have studied the case over the decades have proposed various theories about what may have motivated the Zagwembie vampire. The killer's modus operandi suggested a form of displaced sexual violence, where the act of killing and profaning the body substituted for actual rape. This paraphilia, technically known as lust murder or murder for sexual pleasure, is one of the most disturbing forms of criminal violence, because it combines lethal aggression with erotic gratification in a way that is almost incomprehensible to the normal human mind. The fact that the vampire never sexually penetrated his victims, but always manipulated their bodies in a sexual manner, suggested that his satisfaction did not come from the sexual act itself, but from absolute power over a human being reduced to an object, from the contemplation of a female body completely at his mercy, from the symbolic violation of his victim's most intimate dignity. If Marchwicki was indeed the vampire, then we must ask what forces drove him to commit those crimes. Was it the brutality of his childhood, the instability of a family where the father had married 5 times, the poverty and violence that marked his early years? Was it the trauma of forced labor during the war, the dehumanization he experienced at the hands of the Nazis, the experiences in the Blechhammer concentration camp that may have broken something inside him irreparably? Was it the resentment accumulated over decades of poverty and frustration, the silent rage of a man who felt trapped in a life he had not chosen, married to a woman with whom he maintained a toxic relationship, working in jobs that offered no hope of improvement? Or was there something deeper in him, an innate darkness that would have emerged under any circumstances, a defect in the architecture of his psyche that predisposed him to violence from before he could make his own decisions? These questions have no definitive answers, and perhaps never will. And if Marchwicki was not the vampire, and if the true killer was Piotr Olsowy, or some other individual who was never identified, then the horror multiplies. It means that the serial killer managed to escape justice, that he died without being held accountable for his crimes, that he took his secret to a charred grave, or perhaps to an ordinary hospital bed where he expired from natural causes decades later, with the smile of one who knows he has won the ultimate game against the system. If Olsowy was the real vampire, then his murder-suicide in March 1970 represents both a tragic ending and a kind of twisted justice, the killer punishing himself when the authorities could not. But the murder of his innocent wife and children makes this justice hollow and horrifying, adding 3 more victims to the toll of the vampire's rampage. And if neither Marchwicki nor Olsowy was the killer, if some third man walked free while 2 families were destroyed by accusations and executions, then the horror is complete. Somewhere in Poland, or perhaps in another country entirely, a man lived out his life knowing what he had done, reading the newspaper accounts of the trial and execution, perhaps feeling satisfaction at having evaded the trap that closed around Marchwicki. He may have continued to kill in other places under other circumstances, adapting his methods to avoid the attention that had made him famous. Or he may have stopped. The letter he sent in 1970, a genuine declaration of retirement from his career of murder. We will likely never know. In the nights of Zagłębie, when industrial fog no longer covers the cities but winters remain long and dark, the elderly still tell stories of the vampire to grandchildren who can barely believe that something like that happened in their neighborhoods, on the same streets where they now play without fear. They are stories that mix horror with warning, historical memory with urban legend, documented facts with the embellishments that inevitably accompany every tale, transmitted from generation to generation. The grandparents lower their voices when they reach the most terrible parts, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might awaken something that should remain asleep. The grandchildren listen with eyes wide open, feeling a chill that does not come from the cold outside, but from something deeper, from that ancestral instinct that warns us about the dangers lurking in the darkness. The Zagłębie vampire has become part of the region's folklore, a figure that transcends verifiable facts to install itself in the collective imagination as a symbol of the danger that lurks in the darkness, of the fragility of everyday safety, of evil's capacity to burst without warning into the most ordinary lives. Children growing up in Dąbrowa Górnicza, Sosnowiec, Będzin, learn about the vampire, the same way children in other places learn about the monsters of fairy tales, as a lesson about the dangers of the world, as a reminder that not everything that seems safe really is. And as long as those stories continue to be told, as long as the names of the victims are pronounced even in whispers, as long as the doubts about the true killer's identity persist in the conversations of those who study the case, the Zagłębie vampire will remain open in the court of collective memory, awaiting a final verdict that may never come, floating in that uncertain space between documented history and the myth that arises when the facts are too terrible to be fully comprehended. The Zagłębie vampire continues to cast his shadow over Poland almost 6 decades after the first murder. It is a shadow that extends beyond the individual crimes, encompassing questions of justice, of politics, of national identity. It is a reminder that evil can arise in any society, under any regime, and that the response of institutions to that evil largely defines the moral quality of a nation. Academic studies on the case fill shelves in the libraries of Polish law and criminology faculties. Documentaries about the vampire are periodically broadcast on national television, attracting new generations of viewers who discover with horror and fascination the events of that not-so-distant past. Novels and works of fiction inspired by the case proliferate, some respectful of historical facts, others more freely imaginative, all of them contributing to keeping alive the memory of crimes that marked a before and after in Polish collective consciousness. Poland has changed profoundly since the times of the vampire. It is no longer a Soviet satellite, but a consolidated democracy, a member of the European Union and NATO, a country that has experienced remarkable economic development since the fall of communism. It no longer has the death penalty or trials rigged for political considerations. Its judicial system, though imperfect like all human systems, offers procedural guarantees that would have been unthinkable under the previous regime. But the past does not disappear by decree. The wounds left by the Zagłębie vampire case still fester, and will continue to do so as long as doubts persist about what really happened on those dark streets, in those interrogation rooms where desperate men sought answers at any cost, in that garage where a man was hanged for crimes he may have committed or may never have committed. The darkness that enveloped Zagwembie during those 6 terrible years was more than the absence of light on the poorly lit streets of the industrial cities. It was a moral darkness, an institutional darkness, a darkness that allowed a killer to operate with almost total impunity, and that later perhaps allowed an innocent man to pay for crimes he did not commit. And it was the darkness of the official silence that tried to deny the existence of psychopathic criminals in socialist society. Was the darkness of the militia corridors, where fates were decided without considering the evidence. It was the darkness of the cells, where suspects were interrogated until their wills broke. That darkness cannot be fully illuminated by the spotlights of historical knowledge, nor by the lights of the documentaries that have reviewed the case. It persists in the corners that were not explored, in the testimonies that were not heard, in the evidence that was ignored or destroyed, in the files that remain sealed in archives that may never be opened to the public. And in that darkness still dwells the ghost of the Zagwembie vampire, waiting perhaps for someone to finally decipher the enigma of his identity and be able, at last, to close a chapter that has remained open for far too long, that has tormented an entire region with questions that lack satisfactory answers, that has left in the air the corrosive doubt of whether justice was served or betrayed in that Katowice garage, where Zdzisław Marczewicki drew his last breath. The Zagwembie vampire was a predator who sowed terror for 6 years and whose true identity may never be known with certainty. He was also a product of his time, of a society traumatized by World War, controlled by an authoritarian regime that monitored every aspect of its citizens' lives, but was incapable of protecting its female citizens from the most basic imaginable threat, incapable of publicly acknowledging its own failures and vulnerabilities. And he was, finally, the catalyst for changes that would transform the way Poland addresses the most serious crimes against its citizens, changes that would come too late for the vampire's victims, but that would benefit future generations. His story is a warning and a mirror, a collective tragedy that illuminates both the worst and the most hopeful of the human condition, the capacity to do the most atrocious evil, but also the unwavering persistence in seeking the truth and honoring those who were victims of that evil. As long as that persistence exists, the Zagwembie vampire case will remain alive, not as a morbid celebration of crime, but as a solemn reminder that no life is expendable, no death is forgettable, and no injustice, however old, should be accepted as final, without the truth having been fully established. The legacy is a warning that transcends borders and eras, a permanent reminder that evil exists and can arise at any moment and place, and that our obligation as a society is to be ever vigilant, not only against the predators who lurk in the shadows waiting for their next victims, but also against the systems that can fail tragically in their mission to protect us from them. The Zagwembie vampire reminds us that justice is fragile, that truth is elusive, that certainty is often an illusion we construct to make the world seem more manageable than it really is. The women who died in those dark streets of Poland deserve better than the uncertain resolution their case received. The man who was executed for their murders deserved either vindication or condemnation based on evidence that left no room for doubt. Neither the victims nor the accused received what they deserved, and that failure haunts the case to this day, a specter that refuses to be laid to rest, no matter how many years pass, or how many books are written, or how many documentaries are filmed. The Zagwembie vampire remains, waiting in the shadows of history, a question mark where there should be a period, a mystery where there should be closure, a darkness that refuses to yield to the light of understanding, a wound in the collective memory of a nation that has never fully healed and perhaps never will.